What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim. We are talking state of the Washington Huskies with Hooligan. Before I introduce Hooligan of Sound of the Siren, make sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Apple, Spotify. Follow us on YouTube. Make sure to like, hit that subscribe button. And if you want to send me emails, if you have any questions or any thoughts about the show, make sure to email me at big10footballtalk@gmail.com. Find us on Twitter or X or whatever you call this thing these days. But without further ado, I want to introduce my friend Hooligan from Sound the Siren. Hooligan, how you doing tonight?
Good, Zach. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. It's a good hot summer here in Pennsylvania. What is the weather like out in the Pacific Northwest?
Not that right now. It's what today is what we call around here, particularly come fall. We refer to it as husky weather, gray clouds, some rain. Big Ten teams, both new and old, that are making a venture out this way, particularly, say, the Michigan Wolverines on October 5th. You may experience this. Hopefully, that's not going to be the case for the other purple team that's coming to town in September, which Northwestern's coming to Seattle, I think is game 4 of our season. But September's in Seattle tend to be pretty nice. And I say it all the time that I'll trade some rain in June for nice days at Husky Stadium to start the year. But it is by no means hot or anything approaching summer right now in the Northwest.
Okay. So it's nice and cool right now. So
cool, yes. I don't know if I would put the nice word.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. It's funny. I lived in State College, Pennsylvania for a few years, and we would always joke about how we have more gray days than Seattle, but I don't actually buy it. I think you guys have us beat. So
we have more gray days, but most of the East Coast and a lot of places actually get more rain accumulation than Seattle does. We just have it spread over. Drizzle is a Seattle specialty. It's very rarely is it down or very rarely does it actually, downpour or go completely crazy, but gray and rain and misting or drizzling or sprinkles or whatever you call it. Although sprinkles appropriate considering that's the last name of our new head basketball coach. So we'll go a sprinkle from going
very
forward.
Good.
So.
Very good. Well, before we talk about the program, I'd love the listeners to know a little bit about you. You're part of the College Huddle community. We've been on the Big Ten Huddle together. But how did you get into, one, being a Washington Husky fan, and then two, how did you decide to get into creating the Sound the Siren podcast?
Yeah, so been a Husky fan. I think my wife was asking me earlier this week about like how some of my fandom started, or getting a refresher on how that started. And I mean, I can remember going to a Washington Oklahoma State game mid 1980s. So that would have been like during the era where either Thurman Thomas or Barry Sanders was starting at Oklahoma State. Unfortunately, they came out and beat Washington at Husky Stadium. But I certainly remember just the noise. The crowd is very, very loud at Husky Stadium for matchups where it's needed and appropriate. Early season games against Weber State, probably not going to push the decibel levels too high, or at least we hope we don't have to. But from that to growing up in the Northwest and in particular, as I got a little later into my childhood, my parents were looking for a vacation property over on the Olympic Peninsula, really in one of the golden eras of Husky football. The later part of the Don James era included the national championship season of 1991. Listening to those games while they were out looking at properties, because it was about a 2-hour trip over and a 2-hour trip back, and driving around from little town on the peninsula to little town on the peninsula, looking at different places and just listening to the dogs. Growing into the teenage years, continuing to follow the team. And then ultimately, going to UW and ultimately getting a couple of degrees. I did some volunteering in the athletic department while I was there, and have been basically the Huskies of both football and really every athletic and sports team at UW is my first and foremost team, even more than the Mariners or the Sonics or the, when they were here and will be soon again, or the Kraken or the Seahawks. The Huskies have always been my foremost sporting interest. And then in terms of starting Sound the Siren, so we've got a pretty good podcast and content community at UW, not necessarily to the same extent as some of the Ohio States or Penn States or Michigans of the world that are just by virtue of 100,000 seat stadiums. But one of them that I listen to all the time that had a little bit more of an irreverent take, they stopped recording, and at the time we were going through some interesting circumstances in the program, and it's like, we need, there's other great podcasts that, and I listen to almost all of them regarding UW. I just thought that there was a need to continue to look at it with maybe a little bit more irreverence and keep the humor front and center and commiserate about, goings on in the program. And then myself and a number of people I was in a group chat with for a number of years. And as that podcast kind of waned and stopped recording, I'm like, hey, should we give this a go? And 3 years and change later, here we are, and we recovered from our first season. We started in, I believe, January of 2021, and had very high hopes for the 2021 season, and then that happened. But it's been a lot more fun the last 2 seasons with DeBoer, when DeBoer was in charge, to talk about, hey, what do we think's happening this Saturday? What happened this last Saturday than it was that first season.
As I say, the momentary affliction of 2021 led to the great success of 2022 and 2023.
Yep. some temporary gain or some temporary pain for some longer term gain. We'll take it.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
It was not a whole lot of fun because we were coming out of the Peterson era that had been very successful, and had prior to Peterson's retirement, had really started the recruiting class rankings had really started to climb in the direction they needed to maintain that national level of contention. That, it's not necessarily the foremost expectation of the Husky fan base, but it's not, Washington it's not outside the realm of the possibility for us to be a national championship contending program. It's happened in almost every decade.
Yep.
Of Husky football, with the exception of the early, arguably, kind of depending on when you set the timetable. Obviously, UW was in the conversation in 2000 with an 11-1 season, beat it was that 3, Miami, Florida State, and Washington were all 11-1. I think Florida State we beat Miami beat Florida State, and then and then they picked up a loss somewhere else. And so, like, either of, any of those 3 teams could have ended up in the national championship game. So,
yeah. Well, and I appreciate you even talking about the recruiting, because if I remember correctly, when you were on the huddle, you were mentioning that while the Kalen DeBoer era, was a great success, that one of the struggles was recruiting, which I think was shocking to me, because I'm an outside guy, don't know much about Washington. I knew how great they were this past year and how great that aerial attack was. But it was interesting to hear you talk about the DeBoer era. And I think it'd be interesting for the average fan, because I think the average fan is like, oh, DeBoer was amazing, he's going to be great at Alabama. But can you help the average fan understand the pros and cons of the DeBoer era?
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily, in the scheme of things, I would say the recruiting grade for DeBoer, if you look at his tenure at Washington, there's some pros and some significant areas in areas. But it was, if we're grading, it's finals time on campus or just finished finals time on the campuses, recruiting, and in particular high school recruiting, I would probably say was incomplete. There were some positive strides being made. Defensive back recruiting had taken a pretty big step forward, or back to what it had been when Jimmy Lake was strictly our defensive backs coach and somewhat our defensive coordinator, but certainly not. That did not sustain with Jimmy Lake as our head coach. Pretty good recruiting performance at the tackle position or on offensive line, and talent evaluation with Scott Huff. And really, it was a staff that, from a high school perspective, with a couple of exceptions, quarterback and maybe receiver, was pretty complacent to, or maybe not complacent, but pretty happy to maybe find some a little bit under the radar talent that they felt fit the system and could develop, but weren't necessarily as willing to go head to head for the highest ranked prospects. Like that staff, I mean, it was starting to build, and if the DeBoer staff had stayed in place at Washington, the 2025 class, I think they were building towards, and it was going to look pretty. I would have assumed that it would have taken a pretty big step up in terms of the rankings, just based on what they'd proven on the
Mhm.
field. And then certainly it goes without saying that the NIL infrastructure and NIL is a bigger part of recruiting now than it was previously, and obviously Washington did what it needed to do to bring all of the key contributors from 2022 back for 2023 that led to a team that played Michigan for the national championship. So there's some bona fides there. Is Washington, going forward, do I expect Washington to spend with Ohio State and Oregon? No, that's just not the reality. We don't have a Phil Knight. I think we're chasing, a whale or two, to try and get into that ballpark. Steve Ballmer has been on campus a number of times over the course of the spring since Fisch has been in place. Do I expect Steve Ballmer to invest in Washington the way that Phil Knight has invested in Oregon? No. Could I see it, or am I hopeful that in some way, shape, or form that there's some investments coming towards Washington from some billionaire level or million and multimillionaire level donors and continuing to build that? Yes, it's certainly possible. But day in and day out, or year in and year out, we're not going to spend like Ohio State and Oregon does. That's not going to be what Washington does. Regarding the DeBoer era, I think that the reason that it was incomplete is that even so, like looking forward to the 2024 season, I think we would have been even heavier into the transfer portal than we ended up being with the Fisch staff, and a lot of our recruiting efforts is pivoting more towards some high school emphasis.
Okay. So would you say that then DeBoer was more he was much more focused, like he certainly did high school recruiting, but that there was more of a sense of we need to hit the transfer portal, where it sounds like Jedd Fisch is much more like we got to build this from the bottom up. The transfer portal is a good patchwork, but high schools
Yeah.
are where the lifeblood is.
Yeah, I think with DeBoer, it was evolving a little bit to filling holes, but there are still some significant, there's some significant holes on the roster, and a lot of that talent evaluation and even some under the radar is the case with offensive line. There's some guys with an extraordinary length in that room, but are not physically ready
Sure.
to play day one against, or for round two against Michigan on October 5th, as an example.
Yeah.
Talent, yes. Are they ready physically? No.
Yeah.
So I think the strategy was going to evolve, but I think the transfer portal was going to be a much bigger part of what DeBoer's long-term strategy, had he stayed at Washington, was going to be. Then I just don't think there was the appetite or desire across that entire staff to really get into it for the top level talent. Like at spots like, Austin Mack, who transferred with DeBoer to Alabama, was, I believe, a high 4-star, if not 5-star quarterback, that we pulled from Folsom down in Fresno. There were spots where it was happening.
Yeah.
We pulled a cornerback, a 4-star cornerback named Curly Reed from Louisiana. There were spots that it was happening, but it was not an across the board thing. And the other interesting thing for me with the hypothetical of if DeBoer had stayed at Washington is only part of his staff went with him to Alabama, and part of that staff didn't have any inclination or seeming any interest from Kalen himself to bring them with him.
Hmm.
So I think there was going to be probably some fairly significant staff changes on one side of the ball had DeBoer stayed.
Gotcha. So it sounds like it wasn't just a DeBoer issue with the recruiting, but really it was the staff that he brought in maybe wasn't delivering the way he wanted them to.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a piece of it, and I think that there were, whether it was staff, like Futures, which is our NIL collective. I think there was certainly more of an appetite, or a collective appetite between the two, or between the two groups, to pay for established talent, i.e., again, the portal, than it really was to spend top dollar, for an incoming freshman. But I do think that is changing. Like I think Washington will remain active in the portal going forward,
Yeah.
as needed. But there's much, with the transition to Jedd Fisch, there's definitely a much higher emphasis on high school recruiting. And there's some significant evidence of it already.
Yeah. Well, and it feels like Kalen DeBoer, I think he's one of the best coaches in college football. But it seems like Jedd Fisch is like he seems like an exciting hire and he brings a lot of juice. I have skepticism about him just in terms of his commitment level, which maybe we'll talk about. But what is exciting about the Jedd Fisch era and what concerns you? Obviously the recruiting, it sounds like that emphasis is good. But what else excites you and what concerns you about Jedd Fisch?
Yeah, I certainly think the re-emphasis on high school recruiting is really exciting. Um, I think there's been some battles won, some battles lost already, and time will tell, and the evidence is the evidence, and that can't be argued. I do think I'm encouraged, and one of the reasons that I certainly think that Washington is going to be very competitive this fall. The staff can coach. I mean,
Mm,
Steve Belichick with like the Patriots the last 3, 4, 5 years have not exactly had, world beating talent on the defensive side of the ball or name brands across every level of their defense. But they've been able to be one of the top, one of the better units in the NFL. And that's certainly from a defensive scheme standpoint. And I don't think it's going to be, we run, I think game to game, depending on who we're facing, what the matchup is look like. We're going to be really multiple on that side of the ball. And I think the defense is actually going to take a big step forward from what it
mm,
had been under DeBoer's staff, because it was definitely like you talked about how prolific the offense and the passing offense was. The defense made some plays when it had to, many times when it had to, but was it as stout and just what it was, it close to what the defense had been during most of the Chris Peterson era, which when the defense was the leading side of the ball and the offense was some of the frosting. No. But with some of the returning talent plus some of the transfer talent that the staff has brought in, I think the defense is actually going to do a little bit more carrying of the weight than it had in seasons past. I of course still have, yes, you talk about longevity with Jedd Fisch. Would I'd be lying if I said that 5 years from today or 5 seasons from now, Jedd Fisch, do I think that Jedd Fisch is still the head football coach in the University of Washington? No. And I don't, and I would be very surprised if it was because Jedd Fisch was unsuccessful at Washington and that's the reason that he's no longer here. But the era in large, the era where somebody is a head coach at a school, particularly at a top level school, or somebody that's in the ballpark of the top level, staying there for 20 years, those days are long gone.
yep.
You're going to
Yep.
see, I think you're going to see coaches with longevity at programs that kind of care, but not enough to to do what Nebraska did with Frank Solich and Bo Pelini, where they were winning 9 games every year, but that wasn't good enough. I think those schools are going to be few and far between. I think I think Justin Wilcox, ostensibly, unless he falls off a cliff, Justin Wilcox can be Cal's coach as long as he wants to, because
Yep.
there's not an appetite to, they don't care enough. Jedd Fisch has one of 3 ever 10-win seasons at the University of Arizona. The guy can coach.
Yep.
The guy can coach. He signed Teteroa McMillan after a 1-win season. That's a 5-star receiver that's just an absolute beast. The guy can recruit. I don't like what I make no mistake about it. If Jedd Fisch is still our head football coach 5 years from now, I'm ecstatic because I think he's going to do really good things at Washington. I just don't expect that to be the case.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's helpful to hear that perspective because I know when Fish first left, when he left Arizona, I think there's a sense of resentment for how he left. And I think that can color how we view the coach. And I say, I speak for myself personally. I came on this show and said, I don't like how he left. I don't think he'll do well, but I think that's coming in with a very, just self-admittedly an ignorant perspective because you're making a judgment based on how he left, not how he coached and how he recruited. Um, and we don't know, he might stay for 3, 4, or 5 years. I know Florida is like that's
It's
that like a lot of people they think is his dream job. But I also I don't know. I mean, if Florida opens up Is that really a place I want to go to right now with the SEC looking like how it looks? And I don't know.
You are going to have to do some significant heavy lifting to move Florida back past Georgia, past Alabama, past arguably old. I mean, Florida can't if Florida gets serious, Florida can pass Ole Miss and Mizzou and some of the other schools that are probably in that running for who's third after Georgia and Alabama.
Yeah.
But I don't honestly, if Jedd Fisch is successful at Washington, I think his next job is a head coaching job in the NFL. I don't think it's
Yeah.
another college job. He very well could leave to Florida, but if he leaves for Florida because Florida fires Billy Napier this year, Florida's going to be paying the University of Washington $10+ million in buyout, plus whatever they're paying Billy Napier's buyout. And what Washington will do with athletic director Pat Chun and an appetite and a knowledge that I don't think we're going to see a return to what Washington was in the mid 2000s, where seemingly the administration and the athletic department didn't really much care about sustaining high level success in football. I think that there's a crystal clear understanding both on upper campus and lower campus about how important football is to drive the engine of everything else and being profitable. Washington's going to take that $10 million and go hire as good a coach as it can the next time around. And I will also say on the subject of leaving, yeah, he's our coach now. I take the way Fisch messaged it to his team and said, "Hey, this is what I see as a better opportunity. I'm leaving," as opposed to the hemming and hawing and the this you don't know how hard this decision was and fake crocodile tears and never actually saying anything to the fan base that Kalen DeBoer did. So, but like if and in hindsight, I think I would have respected Kalen a lot more if he just said, "Hey, it's easier to win at Alabama than it is at Washington."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Duh. I mean, it's both an easier job and a harder job than Alabama's an easier job and a harder job than Washington.
Yep.
But we know what Washington fans know what Washington is in the greater scheme of things. We're not Alabama, we're not Ohio State, we're not Michigan, but it's a damn good job and you can be very successful, and it's been proven that you can be very successful at Washington. But
yeah, well,
we have a grasp on reality.
Yeah, well, that leads to where I want to go next, which is I think a lot of Big Ten fans are trying to figure out where does Washington fit kind of in the structure. And we talked about it on the Big Ten huddle. And I think we have an idea. I think we at least have an idea. Like Oregon feels like the new hotness, kind of with Phil Knight and everything. Like they're tier one, but not historically, but they are right now. And USC is kind of the historical tier one, but right now they've underperformed. I think Washington is kind of in this place where I'm like, I don't know where to put them, because I think they have a lot of they're tradition rich, they're historic, they've had two really great years, but then you've got the Jimmy Lakes, you've got the either the mid 2000s. Like, so as a fan and as a Washington podcaster, analyst, as you look at the Big Ten, where does Washington slot?
Yeah, I think I'll use kind of a recruiting tiering structure. I was thinking about it in advance of our conversation this afternoon. I think the true blue chips in the Big Ten are obviously Ohio State and Michigan. To your point, I think, or looking at and it depends on kind of what lens you want to look at it. For 2024, the two best teams going into it are sitting, 90 days or whatever it is till college football resumes. The two best teams in the Big Ten are Oregon and Ohio State. That said, both of them have some significant question marks. Yep. Dan Lanning is yet to prove that he can win a big game. He's yet to beat his primary rival, and he went 1-1 against Oregon State. And when he did play another top level competition to start the year 2 years ago, he got absolutely blasted.
Yep.
I think Ohio State has a very stacked roster, but Ohio State still also has Will Howard at quarterback, and I could be proven wrong, but I need to be proven wrong that Will Howard is a national championship level quarterback. I need to see that from Dillian Gabriel, for that matter.
Yep. Yeah. As a Buckeye fan, I'm right there with you on Will Howard. I am not convinced. So
So, and then so in terms of 2024, I think you've got those two teams are certainly the most talented teams with maybe the least questions going into 2024. But then the rest of the league, it's a Michigan lost every bit as much as Washington did from last season, including their head coach. Two of the other big, teams that had really strong Big Ten seasons, until they can prove that they can consistently and successfully accomplish the forward pass. I'm looking at Penn State and Iowa. Great defenses, good running games. I mean, yes, Penn State's got a great running game, but you got to be able to throw the football, at least some.
Yep.
So I think that I think what was the case, I think, last year with the Big Ten, where there was Michigan and Ohio State and everyone else. I think that's going to be probably very much the case in 2024. In this case, it might be Oregon and Ohio State and everyone else. And what will ultimately gets proven on the field. Penn State and in terms of the bigger lens, Penn State and USC obviously have more established history than the University of Washington. That's just a fact. Does that mean that year in and year out, there's no way in heck Washington can't field a better football team than USC or Penn State? No.
Mm-hmm.
I would put, obviously there's another blue chip or blue blood program in the Big Ten that has not been successful in its entire history in the Big Ten yet, and that's Nebraska. Could they come back? It's possible, but it has to be proven. Everything else is there's absolutely arguments that could be made that Washington is, short to middle term could be as easily as successful as Penn State. Penn State hasn't been to the playoff. Washington has twice.
Mm-hmm.
Iowa, again, can't, until proven otherwise, can't offense. Does that mean I think we're going to... I mean, does that mean that I expect Washington to go into Iowa City this year and win? No. Does it mean that it would shock me if we did? No.
Yep.
It's just anything, can and probably will happen. But head-to-head program history-wise, Washington stack outside of those programs, Washington stacks up pretty favorably with everyone else in the conference.
Yeah. You said something that I feel like was a kind of a duh statement, but it triggered a thought, which is, the Big Ten has had 3 playoff participants in the past 10 years. Michigan 3 times, Ohio State, I think 4 or 5, and Michigan State once. Michigan State sucked.
Got killed. And yes, I'll put it out there. Yes, Washington lost something like 21-7 or 28-7 to Alabama, but the game was actually a lot closer than that for a long period of that game, and there were 2 long runs that broke it open. Yep. I will also, while we're on the topic of the national championship, this game this year, that was not Michigan leading by 3 scores for the entirety of the game.
Oh, yeah.
That game very easily could have been tied late in the third quarter and something that Rome Odunze, 9th pick in the draft, readily admitted that Mike had the read right, and he ran to the post when it should have been to the corner, and it was that far from a catch that would have set the Huskies up with a 1st and 10 at the 15-yard line and a chance to tie that football game.
Yeah. Well, and a hold that nullified a 39-yard gain. And I mean, and if we're going to get on the subject, I mean, I don't want to go deep down the rabbit hole of holding, but cover of Sports Illustrated, there's a fairly clear, at least could have been a hold. And there were some egregious there were holds that were worse than the one that's on the cover of Sports Illustrated that didn't get called. And Michigan got some favorable officiating. I'm not going to say that that's the reason that they won the game. It absolutely wasn't. But you also didn't see Washington anywhere near its best when we lost Dylan Johnson on the first offensive play from scrimmage, and not only in terms of the threat that he provided on the ground, but he was also an exemplary pass protector as a running back, and Michael wasn't comfortable from that point forward. Yep. Well, and I think it's just helpful. Like, I think sometimes you see lopsided scores and you think, oh, like they got crushed. It's like, that wasn't the story of the game. The story of the game was Washington. Like, I think Michigan was certainly was more powerful. But at the same time, like Washington had opportunities to stay in that game and
Kept shooting ourselves in the foot.
yeah, like it was a both and. Like I think Michigan was the better team, and I think Washington could have had a much better shot to win that game if not for
Yep.
injury and for some some blunders that they committed.
Yep. Absolutely.
So yeah,
Including some horrific angles taken on both of Donovan Edwards' long touchdown runs.
yeah, yeah,
Michigan, those runs were well blocked, but
yeah,
there were also some really poor angles taken from
yeah,
somebody that hadn't played much of the season due to injury and got inserted back for whatever reason. So to go
yeah,
back to the DeBoer era question, there definitely were some interesting decisions made in that particular football game that I wonder about
yeah.
in hindsight. But going for to return, but it's Washington's history in the college football playoff is not Michigan State's history of the college football
It's
playoff.
yes, yes.
Washington's semifinal win could and should have been a lot more comfortable than it was
Hmm. Yep.
because Washington controlled most of that football game.
Yeah. It's it's amazing to me, as we're talking about this, like you look at the Big Ten teams who've been in the been in the playoff and won a playoff game. It is now Ohio State, Michigan, and Washington. Which
And Oregon.
oh, that's right, Oregon. I totally I totally did not give Oregon respect for the drubbing of Florida State. Which again, that's also it's a little smoke and mirrors with the 59-20. Like it was certainly a shellacking, but you want to talk about shooting yourself in the foot. That Jameis Winston, yeah. And Hooligan Hooligan
I don't
just
know what I'm
disappeared.
doing, but or it's the Will Ferrell. Jameis pulled a Will Ferrell. I don't know what to do with my hands.
Well, what's amazing is that the same thing happened with Cardale Jones the next game. It was like, I don't know how Oregon is making quarterbacks just forget how to function, like forget fine motor skills. But like, I don't know what they did, but it was insane. Like, I'm like, how does that happen 2 straight games where the quarterback just loses all functionality on a play?
And yet the butt fumble happened for a team that wears green as opposed to a team against a team that wears green.
I did not expect us to go there tonight, but I'm glad that happened. That's amazing. As well done. I see that the irreverence coming out. It's great. Uh, um,
That's on brand for Sound the Siren for
there we
anybody that
go.
hasn't experienced us yet and is willing to give us a shot.
So, so I'm gonna get us back on topic here. It almost, if we're gonna go back to the recruiting analogy, it almost feels like Ohio State, Michigan, maybe even Oregon is your 5-star, like your 5-star recruit,
Yeah, to the Blue
and
Chips.
that Penn State, uh, USC might be like the high 4 stars, and then really Washington slots in as that mid 4-star that once in a while hits, and you're like, oh, this is a game changer.
Washington is Roma Dunze.
Yeah.
although I think if you looked back at it, both Rome and Jalen McMillan were probably closer to that high 4. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's if you look at white chip, red chip, blue chip, Washington is probably closest to a purple chip.
Okay.
No, but pun somewhat intended.
Nice.
But you
Well,
put red and blue
yeah.
together, what color do you get?
Yep, there you go. Well, and I think that's helpful because I think a lot of people, and I think the talent is rising in the Big Ten, like, just talking with different programs, and I don't think it's just people blowing smoke. Like, I think Wisconsin is on the rise. I what Greg Schiano is doing at Rutgers is insane for Rutgers. I mean, I think that qualifier still has to be there, but I mean, it's insane, like, how they're elevating. I think Minnesota's elevating. I think, so Iowa, Iowa's got to learn to offense as you so well put. But like I think Iowa's still a developmental machine. But I think a lot of people are dismissing Washington. And I think it's just helpful to realize actually Washington, like they're not another Iowa. Like, because Iowa hasn't been to the playoff, right? Wisconsin hasn't been to the playoff. Washington has, and they've won a playoff game, and we're actually pretty darn competitive in the national championship game. And so, yes, they might take a step back this year, but let's not forget who they are as a program and what they've been historically. So I think that's just really helpful.
Yep. I mean, if you go back to the Pac-10 era, obviously, or at least the first 25 years of the Pac-10 era, USC was the most frequent champion.
Mm-hmm.
Or was the most frequent either champion or second place finisher. Number 2 was the Washington Huskies.
Mm.
Yeah, like it's like UCLA could be good, but until UCLA proves that they can do it consistently, or
Yep.
frankly proves that they care about football, I'm not going to worry about UCLA.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the parallel is maybe, I don't know if there's a direct Big Ten comparison for UCLA of somebody that could be good and should be good based on their location and has a long ago history of being good. But I mean, maybe they're Minnesota.
Yeah, it might. Well,
A lot of good history, but well in their rearview mirror.
I was gonna say it might be Nebraska.
It could be, although certainly Nebraska's got much more recent high level success in national championship history.
Well, yeah, that's true. I
mean,
I
UCLA was in the
saying.
conversation for the national championship in 1998, but Nebraska won a couple in the 90s and played a national championship game in the 2000s. You got to go back, I think, to 54 for UCLA's last national championship.
Yeah.
So it's been a while.
Yeah. No, sorry. I didn't realize you were talking about the way
but
back.
Still more recent than Oregon's.
Yes. The new hotness.
Had to get that in there.
New hotness. Yeah. It's funny. I'm talking with we're talking with the Quack 12 podcast very soon, and but it'll be it's interesting. I like the dig right there on the Ducks. You know, we've talked a little bit about Washington losing a lot on both sides of the ball. But you seem high on the defense. Who are some of the new faces on both sides? Maybe defense first. That are going to help the Huskies, particularly key playmakers.
Yeah, I mean, defense wise, it's not really a new face, but I think kind of the face of the defense and probably the best player on the defense next year is a Husky legacy, and that's Carson Bruner at linebacker. Who it turns out can also throw the football a little bit. He completed about a 38-yard pass on a trick play in the spring game to Jonah Coleman, who transferred in from Arizona, and kicked a field goal, something that Camden Lewis couldn't do on that end of Husky Stadium this past fall. So I think, certainly, Carson Bruner, I think, is going to be a big key for our defense. Somebody that the NCAA absolutely just jobbed last year, similar to Tez Walker at North Carolina, but didn't actually get eligibility as a defensive end named Zach Durfee, who we expect to be an absolute destroyer based on practice reports, not just this spring against our very much a patchwork ad hoc offensive line, but was having a lot of success last spring against a line that turned out to be pretty darn good. Mm-hmm. I believe they won something called the Moore Award this past fall.
Huh.
Zach Durfee was during the practice reports last spring. So this is the spring before the 2023 season. At times was reported to be unblockable. So that's a big one. Certainly Ephesians Prysock, who transferred in with this staff from Arizona, very, very long corner and defensive back. But I think that's the big, and I think there's a number of different players that are going to be really good. And I don't think it's even, you go game to game. I don't think it's going to be this guy is carrying the team every week in and week out because of Belichick's scheme and scheming for certain matchups. I think Brian Parham, who transferred in from San Jose State, who absolutely can fly as a linebacker, is going to get to some quarterbacks on blitzes and when we bring pressures from unexpected places, and that's going to impact games. It's just going to be a really multiple defense. And then on the offensive side of the ball, the name everybody needs to know is Denzel Boston. And if they don't know Joel, that's the secondary name they need to know if they don't know already, because given Washington had as the first team ever to have a quarterback and 3 receivers drafted in the same draft within the top 3 rounds, Denzel Boston didn't get to see the field very much this past fall. He's going to see a lot of it, and he's going to see the ball a lot this coming fall, and had a pretty exemplary performance in the spring game. And being stuck behind the receivers we just left is certainly no slight on what talent and his ability. And he had, again, was reported, even in the spring last year, like this kid's going to be a good one. And he put that on display a month ago and change now for our spring game. And then if you don't know Jonah Coleman, you need to, because he's a top 3 or 4 back in the Big Ten.
Okay. That's high praise, because this is a running back league. So you'd say top 3 or 4?
Granted, the question, as we talked about on the Big Ten Huddle, the question for Washington for 2024 is the offensive line.
Right.
But Jonah Coleman isn't I think I saw something today that, per PFF, I mean, and you can take PFF with a grain of salt, but the top rated returning running back in the conference, he's about 5'7". He's 5'7", 5'8". I think 220. There were highlights online. He front squatted like 395. He's built basically like a Dodge Charger, but he runs he's a Dodge Charger with nitrous, essentially. Like,
there we go.
The dude can fly. Like, I saw him, and this isn't a slight on our defensive tackle. I saw him hit a defensive tackle at like helmet to center of chest, and the defensive tackle went backwards in our spring game.
Okay.
Just lower center gravity, mass and momentum.
It's like Maurice Jones-Drew.
Down. Yeah. I think a little taller than MJD, but similar.
Okay. And it's Jonah Coleman, Denzel Boston are the two playmakers to watch out. Yeah. And certainly Jeremiah Hunter, who had over 2,000 yards at Cal, which another school not exactly known for offensive wizardry. That says something. And then the return of Cam Davis is certainly eagerly looked forward to. Was projected to be our starter before 2023 and got hurt in fall camp. And that, we talk about the national championship game. If Cam Davis is healthy, that's also a whole different conversation. Yeah. Well, and of course, you guys have a new quarterback too, Will Rogers.
We do.
The
Cowboy?
Yeah. What's your read on him? Like, do you think he can hit like Penix did a couple years ago?
I think holding him to, could he have a season maybe close to what Penix did in 2022? Maybe. I don't also with that offensive line question, I think holding Will Rogers to a Michael Penix standard is not being fair to Will Rogers by any stretch of the imagination, because what Michael Penix did in his 2 seasons at Washington is generational, if not once every quarter century, if not longer. That was what we saw from Michael Penix over the last 2 seasons on Montlake. Can he be very, very good given the weapons and if the offensive line can protect and if we can establish a running game and some play action pass? Absolutely. He struggled a little bit to start the spring game and then kind of found a nice rhythm going to Boston and Jeremiah Hunter. If we can establish, again, is he going to be the guy that I'm like, okay, yeah, Washington, we're going to be right back in the national championship conversation, given the other questions and what we lost both to the portal and the NFL draft? No. Can he be a quarterback that if we get adequate to above average line play where Washington wins 8, 9, 10 games? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so that goes, we talked about a lot about this on the huddle, but ceiling and floor for Washington. Like, do you think Fisch has enough talent to surprise folks this year?
I do. I think the floor is probably something in the 5-7, 6-6 range again if the offensive line struggles, but I think the defense is going to be good enough that unless they're unless the offense just doesn't get going at all,
Mm-hmm.
the defense is going to be good enough to keep them in games. And I think, yes, I agree. It's one of the games that's going to say a lot about Washington this year is going to be what happens when we go to Rutgers at the end of September.
Mm-hmm.
I know Northwestern had a pretty surprisingly good team last year. No offense to Northwestern, but I would be shocked if Northwestern comes to Seattle in September and beats the Washington Huskies. That's just not.
Yep.
that would warning bells would be going off on Montlake in very short order if that were to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you look at, there's not a game on our schedule that is truly like, yep, we have no chance of winning that. I would say probably the thing that I would say is the game that I would say is the most likely loss. It's probably Penn State, just because of the travel all the way across the country. But again, Penn State has to prove that they can throw the football.
Yep.
We'll probably, if they're so running heavy, we're going to probably load the box and make Drew Aller beat us, and we'll see if that happens. And then it's a matchup, and then it goes to a matchup of the Penn State defense against the Husky offense. I didn't say Oregon for a very specific reason. Oregon's probably the best team on our schedule, but it's a rivalry game at the end of a season.
Mm-hmm.
Anything can and will happen, particularly in that football game. Yes, Oregon had a streak of 12 years where they absolutely dominated the Washington Huskies. That streak died about 10, that streak died 8 years ago. The biggest margin of victory either way was during the aforementioned Lake era, where they won by, I think, 9. And every other game other than that has been basically decided by a field goal.
Yep.
Other than the 2 Washington wins in 2016 and 2017, where we absolutely boathoused them.
Yep.
It's going to be a very close football game. It just will be.
Yeah. Well, and I think Oregon, as good as Oregon is going to be, I do think, like, I think their defense will be really good. I don't think it's elite. And, if Will Rogers can be competent, if they have the weapons, if the line can hold up, like, I appreciate what you're saying, because I don't think what you're saying is like, oh, they're going to win every game. They're going to win every game by a couple touchdowns. What I'm hearing you say is like, Washington can compete, and they can win against some really good teams, which I
and they're going to
think
lose against them. And I honestly think that they're going to lose against some good teams. And
yeah.
I mean, I expect us. I won't ever say that I expect us to lose against Oregon, because I don't want to ever admit that. I just not in my DNA. Going into, we riffed on this on Sound the Siren, that like we'll do a joking prognostication of a season, and I'll find some way to predict that the Huskies are going to lose every game except those against Washington State and Oregon, because I just won't say that that's going to happen. It hurts my soul too much to try and say that. But there's, like I said, there's no game on the schedule that isn't winnable. But again, it's the question mark is if it turns out that our offensive line plays like 5 20-year-old versions of me, then we're in a lot of trouble. We're in a big trouble, because I'm 5'10" and could not hold up against a 300-pound Division I athlete by any stretch of anybody's imagination. However, if they're, like I said, I'm not even expecting them to be great. If they're average, there's enough in place on the defense and at the skill positions for the Huskies to be dangerous.
Yep. Well, and they get Michigan at home. They get USC at home. They get UCLA at home. Yeah, and I mean, I was looking at the schedule, and the first 4 games, I feel pretty confident they're 4-0 going into Rutgers. Mm-hmm. Weber State, Eastern Michigan, Washington State without Cam Ward, which, I think we both have strong opinions about Cam Ward. But yeah, Buckeye fans, we want Cam Ward. No, we don't. We don't want Cam Ward. I want him less than Will Howard. You can have him, Miami. Goodness gracious. And then Northwestern. I think that's 4-0. And then I think Rutgers, I mean this seriously, and people know, like, I'm high on Rutgers this year. Like,
Mhm.
I think that
They're a
is
good
a
football team.
test. Yeah,
It is a test. It absolutely is. That's
yeah,
why I said it. Like that game is going to tell me something.
yeah.
Because if we go out to Rutgers and win and look good doing so,
That means something.
my game week prediction on Sound the Siren going into Michigan is probably going to be considerably more optimistic.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So you would say like 9-3, 9-3, 10-2 might be like,
I think 10-2 is maybe the high end. I think probably it feels more somewhere like I think the likeliest are going to be somewhere in that 8-4, 9-3 ish range. If we win 9 games in a bowl game, it's going to be a job well done for Jedd and the staff.
yeah.
And there will not be a Husky fan other than those that just are permanently miserable, and we do have a few of those. We just try and ignore them on Twitter as much as possible, or call them out. We call them out in our segment on Sound the Siren called "Stupid Tweets" about as often as we call out insanity from Oregon fans. So
That sounds fun.
we're not afraid of naming and shaming our own when the situation calls for it.
Oh, yeah. Nothing like insecure fans. I don't know any. I don't know any that I it possibly couldn't be me. I'm not at all one of those. You'd probably reading my tweets every week.
It happens to all of us. We all have our moments of don't you dare say that about my football team.
Oh man. All right, so switching gears, and I'll get you out on these two things. First off, if we were to visit to watch a game at Husky Stadium, where are some key places to grab a bite to eat, and like what is unique, particularly to University of Washington?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's anything specifically noteworthy about like the in-stadium dining experience.
Oh, out of the stadium, out of the
Yeah,
stadium. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, out of the stadium, Washington is one of I think 3 places in D1 in the entire country you can take a boat to a game. So sailgating if you can manage it, and there's, um,
That's
yeah,
cool.
yeah, and it's not on with apologies to the Vol Navy and to Baylor, and less apologies to Baylor because it's a small river in Texas. So um, you're right on Lake Washington, which connects by a boat that you can take basically from the stadium, or if you have a boat moored outside the stadium, you can be out in Puget Sound, which ultimately leads to the Pacific Ocean in the space of about 40 minutes.
Wow.
Out through the Ballard Locks. So that's definitely something that's unique to Seattle and the University of Washington. I mean, we have like for people if they're coming out to visit for a game, there's so many things to do in Seattle. I mean, knock on wood, Mariner baseball might be still being played. Say when Michigan comes to town in early October, we're hopeful, but not counting on that because life as a Mariners fan is disappointment. But there's great Italian food. Get over to Woodinville if you like wine. Woodinville has 60, 70 wineries with tasting rooms in Woodinville. A great way to spend a Friday. We do wine pretty well in the Northwest. We also do beer pretty damn well in the Northwest. Microbrews by the score. There's a great, a number of great microbreweries in Ballard, including Lucky Envelope. If you like to hike and get out into nature, there's things to do on the Olympic Peninsula. There's things to do up in the Cascades. I live about 40 minutes from campus, and have hikes by the score within a 10 to 15 minute drive, if not 5 minutes. I mean, like, pick your flavor. It's available for you in Seattle. It really is. If you're a fan of donuts, venture up onto Capitol Hill and find Half and Half Donut Company. It's worth the trip. I'll just put it that way.
Wow.
It's.
I am wearing a donut shirt as we speak.
Okay, so there you go.
I got eat more donuts or eat more Whole Foods, which
Yep. No, that's
writes itself.
Yeah. There's countless. I mean, honestly, recommendations like I said, it's such a huge city and metropolitan area that pick your flavor, pick your favorite things to do. You can find it in Seattle, and that's one of the challenges that Washington even faces in terms of, well, why doesn't it have the presence of a fan base of the rest of the Big Ten? And because Washington and Seattle is not like most college towns in the Big Ten. It's
Right. Yeah.
The University of Washington in Seattle is not like, has challenges that very few other major Division I programs have in terms of the competitive landscape and even just the sports landscape of the city itself.
Yeah.
But feel free, anybody that's looking for recommendations, please feel free to tweet at me, giving guidance on things that people like to do, make some suggestions, because I try and be pretty versatile in what I do. I'm a foodie. I like to play golf. I like to hike. Number of I can find myself doing when not living and breathing Husky football and Husky athletics in general.
Very good. Well, yeah, there's a lot.
Getting burgers out and I will say I'd also be remiss at getting burgers at Dick's is a Seattle, it's a Seattle tradition. There's one across the freeway from campus. It's a bit of a from the stadium itself, but Dick's is a Seattle institution, pays their employees really well. It's not like a gourmet burger by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a dang good burger for a dang good price. So
what is there do they have like any specialty, not specialty, like as in like Wagyu or anything, but like, do they have special toppings or anything? Just regular cheeseburger?
Yeah, regular cheeseburger, regular hamburger, Dick's Deluxe with, their special sauce and some fries and a shake. It's your kind of 50, classic 1950 style.
Oh,
McDonald's,
so
but much better than McDonald's. And
yeah, those are, as much as we try to like make burgers like gourmet now, sometimes all you need, like, I love Five Guys.
Yeah.
And like, if you have a secret sauce, I'm in. I'm sold.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fast food hamburger, but it's a good one, and it's at a very reasonable price, and it's a Seattle staple. So
there you go. That's, if I get to Washington, that's where I'm going. That's
Dick's and a can of Rainier.
Sounds good.
Like I said, there's a time and place for microbrews, but there's a time and place for just a good straight ahead domestic lager, and Rainier is basically my go-to tailgate beverage.
Okay. Is that local to Seattle?
It was a long time. It's still used. They still use the Rainier recipe, but I don't know that it's still brewed here anymore. But
okay.
With all the beer industry consolidation and purchases and.
Yep. That makes sense. Business. Hooligan, where can we find you on social, and when do you drop podcasts, and what are you doing currently with the podcast?
So my at on Twitter is here in the video, which is at Hooligan7_STSUW. Also, usually the one posting on at Sound the Siren UW, which is the case for basically all of our socials. I think my Instagram, is Hooligan7UW. I'll have to double check on that. We are in a little bit of our slow period on Sound the Siren, but we have started. We've done a couple of conversations with current players about their experiences at Washington. We are starting a Montlake Memories kind of sub-series, talking to former UW athletes about their time at Washington, and certainly also partially inspired by, it's now a retrospective look at University of Washington athletics in the Pac-10 and Pac-12 eras, unfortunately and fortunately, depending on your perspective. If you're looking back, it's unfortunate. If you're looking forward, it's fortunate that we're still in the top tier of collegiate athletics. But so that's some of the things we're doing. I anticipate we'll be every couple of episodes every month for the next couple, and then as we get closer to the season, we'll ramp it up and be talking dogs every week.
Cool. And when do you guys typically drop episodes?
We usually record Wednesday nights. It can depend somewhat on my timetable and work schedule in terms of if I'm able to edit and post on Thursday, or whether there's sometimes a delay or an intentional delay to drop it on a Monday or a Tuesday.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, thank you for joining us. Really appreciated the conversation. Make sure you like and follow Sound the Siren. Make sure to follow Hooligan on the socials. And of course, make sure to like, subscribe here on YouTube and on Spotify. Follow us. Hooligan, thanks again for joining us. For the rest of you,
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And we got to get you on again. Maybe before
Anytime.
that Washington Michigan game, we'll get you on. So,
I'm
but for
in.
the let's do it. For the rest of you guys, thanks for listening. Take care. God bless.